Hello, neighbor. Nice house you got there. A little too much free time, huh? Yeah, must have taken a while to build that clusterfuck, dig graves inside of it, lay some railroad track that does not look up to code, by the way. We'll see what the local housing association has to say about that. But blah the bureaucracy. This is about the mystery. The mystery of this mysterious neighbor man who builds a chaotic contraption and calls it home. He has mannequins everywhere, various burial sites with mannequins in them, a mechanical shark with surprisingly no mannequins associated with it, and random doorways everywhere inside of rooms and corridors that themselves make no sense whatsoever. If I didn't know any better, I'd say this guy is crazy! But maybe I'm just being judgmental. Anything is possible in the age of postmodernism. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Grant, and every Thursday I dive deep into video games and stuff to collect that golden nugget of truth that you totally didn't know. Because otherwise, I'd be a fraud. And I don't make videos on the internet for a living to tell lies and boring surface-level observations. If you want your mind blown once a week, hit that bell notification button down below so you don't miss anything. Also, you may have noticed that the sound quality is a little different for this video. That's because I'm home for Christmas and recording this on a more portable mic in my childhood room's closet. Fortunately, my mom took it over with her clothes, so there's a good amount of sound dampening in here. Thanks, Mom! But now, we're getting to the heart of the contraption. In fact, what if I told you that this neighbor has a haunting past? We're going to stare into the soul of this batshit crazy neighbor and pry out the answers to what kind of life could drive a man to this level of insanity that would allow this clusterfuck of a house to be conceived of, let alone built. Seriously though, man, Home Depot must love you. Customer of the year, hands down. Our neighbor's story is found in the muckety-muck of facts and evidence sprawled throughout the game. It's a tale sparked by tragedy and carried by insanity into the darkest depths of human suffering. No such house is built by a man who is well. Speaking of which, what if I also told you that there is a real-life parallel to this cancerous dwelling that ties together everything? Pretty spooky, eh? And I ain't exaggerating. Keep watching, and it will all make sense. Welcome to the story you never knew. Let's start with the basics, shall we? First of all, this game is still in alpha, so there's a lot of changes happening with every update. Like, a lot of changes. For instance, the most recent update, Alpha 3, is way different than the previous Alpha 2. And this is just gonna keep happening, people, so we gotta be careful. That being said, let's look at what we know. In the opening cutscene of Alpha 3, we see the character we play as moving into the exurbs of a big city, only to encounter his neighbor's house? Well, it's definitely a house, and the guy we think of as our neighbor certainly occupies it. But there's something odd. The Alpha 3 opening cutscene closes with the view of the ridiculous house and ends before we see the player guy go into his house. Odder still, when the game begins, we don't begin in the house that's supposedly ours. We start outside with our car and a bunch of our boxes that still haven't been moved in. It's almost like we're waking up there. Now let's take a look at Alpha 2. And yes, I know it's no longer the newest version, but that doesn't mean TinyBuild Hello Neighbor's developer is scrapping the story elements told within it. I say that unless an update contradicts an older version, then we can assume that the older version contains elements of the story that haven't been fit into the bigger picture yet. And that's why these plot themes don't appear in the newest alpha. Not in this one at least. And if you want an example, don't worry, I've got one. Exhibit A! The Alpha 2 opening cutscene shows the player moving into the neighbor's house, the version we see in Alpha 2 that is, until the neighbor grabs us while we're what I believe to be drugged. So, this crazy bastard stole our house? Or we tried to steal his house. Either way, it's weird. And judging by how quickly the player goes from normal waking consciousness to being incapacitated in a sleepy daze, it's clear that we've been drugged. Oh, and during actual gameplay, you can find sleeping pills around the house and can even poison the neighbor guy with them. Pretty slam dunk that we got roofied or something in Alpha 2. Alpha 3 doesn't dispute this either. Remember that the opening cutscene stops before we see which house the player enters, and the game starts back up when we're already outside, our moving boxes only partially unpacked. So really we can't throw out the information from Alpha 2 or even earlier alphas, because again, it could have plot elements that haven't been worked into the bigger picture yet because the game isn't done. What this really boils down to is this. Just because a Hello Neighbor update is the newest doesn't mean it contains all the answers. Still don't believe me? Exhibit B! In Alpha 2, we're able to access a basement that consists of long, creepy, candlelit corridors and baby stuff and mannequins. But in Alpha 3, if we walk through this same door that leads to the basement, we're shown a cutscene of our neighbor sobbing in the corner of a surreal, brightly lit room. Then the game ends, and that's it. No basement. We get a new cutscene, but the basement is gone now. So Alpha 2 objectively contains information that Alpha 3 does not. At least until the console gets enabled for Alpha 3 and people ghost into the basement. But you get the point. If we're to understand what's really happening in this bizarre and twisted franchise, then we need to understand that the latest updates don't completely replace the older ones. So hopefully that makes sense, because I can't stress that point enough. Alright, let's move on, shall we? I said that Alpha 3 has a cutscene instead of a basement, so let's take a look at that. As we walk through the door, we see Mr. Neighborman sobbing into his hands in what appears to be a flashback. Did the end of Me Before You get you too? I know it got me. If we're being realistic, it probably wasn't the movie. Rather, it must be something even more tragic. Do you think there are some clues lying around the house? Of course there are! When we look around the neighbor's house, we see drawings on the walls that are clearly drawn by the hand of a child. Not to mention, there's a painting that depicts a husband, wife, and kid. Pretty odd for a man who lives alone. And it gets a whole lot odder than that. In Alpha 1, there's a room, obviously, but this room is special. It's a child's room. There's drawings around the perimeter, a crib in the center, along with a mannequin and a teddy bear. But do you see how they are positioned? The mannequin and teddy bear are positioned to represent a woman reaching to pick up her child. Why would our neighbor friend do such a thing? Unless he felt a longing to see this image, as though he's trying to maintain a delusion that his wife and child are still alive. Whoa. Yes, I'm saying our neighbor once had a wife and child, until they died. The mannequin and the teddy bear, the child drawings, the sobbing, the insanity, all of it points towards a happy family that is no longer. Indeed, it's only this kind of tragedy that could push a man to build such a monstrosity, even though it is kinda cool looking. It's still sad though, damn it! Now I'm sure there's those of you out there on the internet that still don't believe me, and I get that. But let's put that haterade away for just a moment, cause I ain't done yet. Recall that earlier in the video, I made the bold claim that there exists a house in real life that is uncanny to our neighbor's creepy, clusterfucky house. The stories between these two dwellings are so similar that in my opinion, it's undeniable that this eerie real-life occurrence justifies everything I've said about our neighbor's haunting past. So let's get into it, shall we? Far out west in San Jose, California, there's a spooky place called the Winchester Mystery House. Does its architecture look familiar? This mansion has countless bizarre rooms, long, pointless, winding corridors, staircases to nowhere, doorways that lead to nothing but a 3-story drop to the ground below. The similarities are undeniable. And the best part? It doesn't stop there. What do you think would drive someone to construct such a haunting mansion in real life? This thing is easily larger than our neighbor's house and is arguably even spookier. So what gives? Oh, I'm glad you asked, because what if I told you it was almost exactly the same story that supposedly led our neighbor to build his mystery house? Have you drank the last drop of your haterade yet? Good. The mansion you see before you was built by Sarah Winchester. There's no need to go into the entire backstory of this woman, so let's just touch on the important points. In 1862, Sarah married William Winchester, the only son of the man who invented the famous Winchester repeating rifle. You may not have heard of this rifle. Just know that at the time of its invention in the mid-1800s, it was the most efficient and reliable and mass-producible killing machine to ever exist. It was the gun that won the West. The amount of lives taken by this weapon is staggering. It was deadly accurate, could fire several shots before having to reload, and it rarely jammed. This gun's invention would change Sarah Winchester's life in a way she never imagined. 4 years after Sarah and William's marriage, the couple had their only child, a daughter, but they only lived happily for all of 4 weeks before the daughter passed away from severe malnutrition. This tragedy caused Sarah to fall into a depression so deep from the horrific experience of losing a child that she would never fully recover. 15 years later in 1881, her husband caught tuberculosis and died at the young age of 43. Mrs. Winchester's depression got out of control, and so she sought help from a spiritualist in Boston, who explained that her family and fortune were being haunted by the spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifles, and that these spirits were responsible for the untimely deaths of her daughter and husband, and that Mrs. Winchester was next on the list. This doesn't seem too pleasant. I mean, the last thing I would want to be is on a spirit's shit list. I have enough trouble dealing with negative YouTube comments, let alone invisible spirits from the great beyond. But don't worry, there was an alternative. Miss Winchester had an opportunity to appease the spirits by moving west and building a super sweet house for them. But if the construction of said house were to ever stop, she would join her family in death. Bunch of needy bastards, those spirits are. She took her hefty inheritance from her dead husband and moved to San Jose, purchased an unfinished farmhouse, and immediately hired carpenters to start adding onto it. She didn't use an architect, and the additions to the initial building were original, to say the least. There were stairs that went nowhere, windows that overlooked other rooms of the house, and doors that opened into nothing. And the best part? This house is said to be haunted as fuck. It's so supposedly haunted, in fact, that Zach Bagans himself did an episode of Ghost Adventures there. Zach Bagans, everybody!
They want us to die here.
But before I get too off topic, does this house description remind you of anything? Of course it does. Or maybe it doesn't, but I'm gonna tell you anyways. Look at our neighbor's house in Alpha 3. You can really see the outline of the original house in this design, in that everything above it and around it has been added on. There's a bunch of rooms that were added on, and a windmill, and a roller coaster. Oh, the spirits are gonna love that. But the outside is just the beginning. Looking inside, we see some strange stuff too. Doors that lead to nowhere, corridors that wind forever, rooms that make no sense at all. Strange eye paintings on the walls. Architecture decisions that could only be described as unique. And if these house design choices just weren't enough, look at what's hanging on the wall of the house. A rifle! A rifle that looks eerily similar to the Winchester. And you can find these bad boys in several areas. The developer could have chosen any gun to hang on the wall, but they chose a rifle. A Winchester-styled rifle inside a Winchester-styled house. Can't just be a coincidence. In fact, the only way to solidify this connection even more would be if our neighbor's house was also haunted. Which, surprise surprise, it totally is. We'll get to that in a second though. The takeaway from this long, tragic story is that Sarah Winchester lost her spouse and child. 2 events that would drive her to depression and madness so deep that it would manifest as the Winchester Mystery House. A house that is impeccably similar to our neighbors, where reminders of happy times long past decorate the chaos. These parallels between the real-life Winchester mansion and our neighbor's house are either an absurd coincidence or Tiny Build was inspired by real-life events and a real-life spooky mansion. So then, is it so far-fetched that if the architecture matches, the tragedies do too? The loss of a spouse and a child? This is getting dark, so let's make it darker. Not literally. There we go. In a small room in the house, ghostly demonic voices are heard clear as day, seeming to come from a mannequin. At the top of the stairs next to the gate, we also hear knocking behind the door. But when we go to the other side, no one is there. But here's a key but minute difference. While the Winchester mansion is supposedly haunted by regular ghosts, our neighbor's house is haunted by demons. As MacLeod and the game theorists pointed out with some pretty solid evidence, our neighbor likely cut a deal with the devil. I don't feel the evidence is necessary to reiterate in this video, outside of this blatant 666 on the neighbor's shoe. Look at it! Look at it! And while we're not entirely sure that there is satanic intervention here, a demonic presence of some sort is hard to dispute. Given MacLeod's explanation, the blatant 666 on the neighbor's shoe, and demonic voices in this room in Alpha 3, there is definitely a dark presence in this house. The question is, what prompted this dark presence? In Mrs. Winchester's case, she believes it was due to the wealth of her family gained from the war. But in our neighbor's case, it isn't quite so easy. At this point, point, we have determined that Mr. Neighbor once had a wife and child, but they both passed away, driving our neighbor to exhaust all options trying to get them back. This is where the basement in Alpha 2 comes in. After completing the puzzle and unlocking the door, we get down into the basement and hear two voices, one of a woman and one of a child. In one of the main rooms down there, we see a mattress and a crib surrounded by candles, a sign that there are most likely people down here, an adult and a toddler. Weirder still, in Alpha 3 during the crying ending, if you look through the keyhole of one of the doors, you see the silhouette of a person, presumably a man, just standing there. Some speculate this is the man who killed the neighbor's family. The only evidence for this is that this man is associated with the neighbor sobbing by being present in this scene. Clearly he has something to do with the neighbor's broken state. And so, I'd like to tie a bow on this theory. A pretty bow that will blow your fucking mind. We see nothing out of the ordinary during this sobbing scene. It looks precisely like a normal house. This means we're in a flashback to the time just as our neighbor was losing his mind, when a man broke into his house, murdered his wife and child, and thrust our neighbor into his deep insanity. Then, for similar reasons for setting up the mannequin baby scene, our neighbor kidnaps a woman and her child, locks them in the basement to keep them safe, and obscures the way into the basement by hiding keys and keycards throughout a mazy, impossible to navigate house. But that's not all. With the help of the devil and the lives of the woman and child he kidnapped, perhaps our neighbor can bring back his beloved deceased. He's already plunged so far into the mindset of darkness, a deal with the devil and a sacrifice of life would be just another step. But don't take my word for it. Just look at the lengths Mrs. Winchester went to find her peace of mind. She certainly avoided satanic rituals, but with the houses, the rifles, the hauntings, the tragedies all lining up so perfectly, our neighbor's inner struggle becomes an external tragedy for all to see. That is, if you can stand to look at it. And that's the story. You never knew. Well, that got dark, but that's what makes it interesting. If you made it this far, then I assume you like Hello Neighbor, so comment down below if you want us to make more videos on it and have any suggestions for anything we missed. We had to omit a ton of stuff for the sake of time. There's so much more we can talk about. I'm getting giddy just thinking about it. And as always, give this video a like if you enjoyed it and a dislike if you didn't. Feedback is the path to holiness. Or something like that. So, help us achieve enlightenment! Also, if you enjoyed this video, then check out our last story you never knew that unravels the mystery surrounding the latest Five Nights at Freddy's update. Yet another mystery that needs solving. You won't be disappointed. Anywho, it's about time I head out. See y'all in the next video! You beautiful person, you!